Super Smash Bros. Melee is one of the most popular fighting games out there. It's amassed a massive following over the years, and people have dedicated thousands of hours to become the best of the best at this game. But despite that, that's not really what the game was designed for. That's not what the devs had in mind. Smash Bros. Was designed to be a casual game, a party game that anyone could pick up. In fact, the reason that Smash Bros. Was designed in the first place was to explicitly have a fighting game that lowered the skill gap. Masahiro Sakurai felt that the traditional 2D fighting games were far too punishing to new players, so he came up with a concept for a fighting game where an inexperienced player would still be at a disadvantage, but at least they'd have a chance, at least they'd be able to have some fun. But despite that goal, the Smash Bros. Series, especially Melee, has a ton of skill expression and depth to it. And when a game has lots of skill expression and depth, of course people will try and become the best they can possibly be at it. And people will try and compete against others for that juicy title of the greatest of all time. Now, of course, there are still casual Smash players. In fact, the majority of the player base is made up of a casual audience. But there is still a very large demand for taking the game seriously, despite what the developers intended. This is a phenomenon that I have dubbed Melee syndrome. When a game was designed with casual gameplay in mind, but the game has enough skill expression and depth for it to garner an audience of extremely dedicated high-level players. So of course Melee has shown this phenomena along with the rest of the Smash Bros. Series, but there are countless other games out there that have this sort of thing happening. I mean, just a few days ago, the people behind Slap City released Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl. It's a platform fighter that literally has SpongeBob in it, but it also has wave dashing. So as you can imagine, it's attracted all of the usual suspects from the Melee community into that game too. Whether this game will actually last, only time will tell. But it seems clear to me that it's aimed at a casual audience. Like I said, SpongeBob's in it. But it has skill expression, it has wave dashing, so people are going to take it seriously, whether the developers wanted them to or not. Rocket League's another one that springs to mind. It's a funny car game where you drive into a ball and play football. Literally anyone can get behind this concept and have some fun dicking around in this game. But with a rank ladder that goes from bronze all the way up to Supersonic Legend. As well as a tournament scene with prize pools in the millions, this game has clearly garnered a competitive audience that would go way over the head of the average casual player. Another great example is one of those few games that I talk about way too much on my channel, Team Fortress 2. A game designed for 12 vs 12 clusterfucks on maps with tiny choke points literally everywhere somehow managed to sprout a competitive audience that created their own community rule sets for 6 vs 6 and 9 vs 9 Highlander game modes. And TF2's competitive scene never really took off the same as games like Counter-Strike or Dota's scenes did. And the main reason for it is that Valve never really backed the tournament scene for this game. And if you ask me, the reason for that is that these two games were designed with competitive play in mind, whereas TF2's competitive scene was community driven, with a community created rule set that didn't realistically reflect the game as a whole. Competitive Counter-Strike is the exact same game as casual Counter-Strike. The only difference is that these guys are better than you'll ever be at anything in your life, whereas competitive TF2 is nothing like casual TF2. To make TF2 a competitive game, you have to limit weapon unlocks, you have to add a map pool, you have to add class limits, all things that don't exist in the casual game. Valve didn't support the tournament scene for TF2 not because there was no demand for it, but because they didn't really want or need their most casual game having a competitive audience to be marketed towards. But the demand for it was certainly there, because just like all the other games we're going to talk about, the game being designed for a casual audience doesn't mean that there's not a high skill ceiling in that game. And any online multiplayer game with a very high skill ceiling is going to attract the tryhards who want to show the world how many air shots they can land. In fact, the game doesn't even need to be an online multiplayer game. Speedrunning is the way that a lot of single-player games will show off their Melee syndrome for the world to see. Because single-player games can have a tremendous amount of skill expression too. Pretty much every single-player game ever made is designed for a casual audience, but if there's tons of cool mechanics and difficult tech in these games, then people are going to obviously want to show off that they're the best at it. There are of course other ways to show off this skill. No-hit runs in Dark Souls, Eden streaks in The Binding of Isaac, high scores in classic arcade games. However, the most universal way to show off skill in a single player game is speedrunning. Games like Super Mario 64, Super Mario Odyssey, Celeste, every Zelda game ever made, Hollow Knight, all of these games have extremely dedicated speedrunning communities that will grind for thousands of hours to save a quarter of a second on their personal best. Some single-player games are designed with speedrunning in mind, but they're still fun, casual experiences for the majority of their players. And hey, even some multiplayer games have speedrun communities. Community movement game modes in the source games have very dedicated speedrun communities competing with each other for the fastest times on certain levels. And Momentum Mod, when it releases later this year, will be compiling all of these source movement game modes into one single game for people to grind away at. The final example that I could come up with for this video of Melee Syndrome is Dead by Daylight. It's that asymmetrical horror game that everyone's been raving about recently. Everyone, including me, actually. The game's really good, but you don't have to play it for very long to quickly realise that the game was designed with casual play in mind. There's two teams, the 4 survivors and the 1 killer. The 4 survivors have a very simple objective to complete, and although teamwork is the most effective way to win, at low levels you can sort of just run around doing your own thing and you're not going to be punished all that hard for it. The 1 killer has a much more complicated job. They're constantly stretched thin across the 4 survivors, pressuring them from all sides. But again, at low ranks, none of that matters, because the survivors aren't really doing anything very efficiently. So the killer is able to just run around doing nothing and do dumb stuff without really being punished all that hard for it. What this ends up meaning is that a new player playing killer is able to just run around wailing on survivors as much as their heart desires, and new survivors are able to sneak around and hide from the scary monster with their friends. Its new player experience is great in that regard, and it's not done by accident. It's to cater to that casual audience. But despite all that, this game has a very, very high skill ceiling. The difference between a good survivor and an incredible survivor is enormous, and the difference between a good killer and an incredible killer is just as big. There are even killers in this game that you have to have a PhD in mathematics to actually be able to play. Killers like Blight. He's a very, very fast boy, but he's also extremely difficult to play optimally. Bumping into the right obstacle at the right time to aim your rush at a survivor is extraordinarily difficult and takes thousands of hours to master. And like we've already discussed, when a game has this high of a skill ceiling, the sweaty tryhards will come along and try and show off that they're the best of the best. Unfortunately for this game though, this game's balance massively breaks down at higher levels. There are tournaments of Dead by Daylight, but it's an asymmetrical game, and at the highest level, the game is tremendously survivor-sided. So unless you play Spirit or Nurse, the 2 best killers in the entire game, you're going to have a very, very hard time killing a single survivor, no matter how good you are at the game. But despite the tremendous balance issues the game suffers with at higher levels, Dead by Daylight still has its devoted competitive players who push the game to its absolute limits. Melee Syndrome, despite its infectious-sounding name, isn't necessarily a bad thing. Taking these sorts of games seriously isn't necessarily something that should be discouraged, because these games clearly have something worth devoting the time towards, otherwise no one would do it. But it can sometimes be an unfortunate sight when the developers that rule over your favourite game don't really take the competitive scene you hold so dear very seriously. Or you could be like Nintendo, who not only don't take the scene seriously, but they actively try and come after it. Like how they literally nuke Smash tournaments from orbit without stating a reason why, just because they can. Taking these casual games seriously is not a bad thing, but sometimes it can be hard to convince the developers to make any changes in your favour if their game is aimed at a casual audience. Because the casual audience for these games is the overwhelming majority of the player base. The competitive players are a tiny percentage of the overall players, so there's no real incentive for these companies to actually care about you, unfortunately. If there's any other good examples I missed, do let me know. Also, something like and subscribe. This joke's getting really old now, isn't it? Oh my god. Melee is the shining star example of Melee Syndrome, because even though it was designed as a casual game, and even though Nintendo will randomly hunt the tournaments for sport, the competitive scene still has massive prize pools with a massive player base and a number of career players solely dedicated to the game. And all of that is without Nintendo's help. Unfortunately, not every game is as fortunate as that, but I find it pretty admirable that people will still commit to their favourite games regardless of whether it's going to take off or not. Thanks for watching.